This is American Beauty, a podcast about the difficult but beautiful work of democracy in our moment. I'm Joanna Brooks. If you feel like something is at stake right now, something much deeper than winning and losing elections, you're not alone. Democracy is about how we live, talk, think, and fight with each other. It's everyday work, and a lot of it is done by women. This podcast amplifies the voices of women like you who are doing the work now, and the voices of women experts who can help us see more clearly and get grounded for the work that lies ahead. Episode 1, Part 2. The November 2016 election brought up difficult issues for my family or personal history. How do I manage my anxiety? A few months ago, I surveyed more than 1,000 women public radio listeners over the age of 35. How have you been feeling since November 2016, I asked. The number one answer, anxious. There's so much in our political climate that has the capacity to stir up difficult memories and the feelings that come with them. Many of us who have been sexually harassed or violated know what it's like to feel that surge of adrenaline, that fight, flight, or freeze kick in when we realize once again that the people elected to power have troubling histories of sexual misconduct. If you're an immigrant or a person of color, if you're LGBTQ, you know what it's like to be on edge just walking around in the world. Now, seemingly more so than ever. We know so much more than we used to about how difficult experiences impact us. Words like trauma, anxiety, hypervigilance, amygdala, even epigenetics. The idea that traumatic experiences are inscribed in our DNA and passed on to our children. These words have entered our national vocabulary. Therapy, Zoloft, now more than ever, these are a part of our daily lives. And for many, it's all for the good. But how do we understand the impact difficult personal and family histories have on democracy? In part 1 of this episode, we talked to Suzanne Salser-Yesk, a 79-year-old Holocaust survivor for whom the 2016 presidential election season brought up difficult memories of her family's past, memories that she hasn't known entirely what to do with.
Either you get a group of people together who also went through similar experiences that you went through as a child, or if you go to a psychiatrist or a psychologist, right, and you unwrap yourself.
It's worth thinking about how traumas are not just individual, but historic and shared, and how they influence our politics.
My name is Monica Casper. I'm a professor of gender and women's studies and a professor of public health and affiliated with the School of Sociology and Africana Studies at the University of Arizona. Currently, I'm Associate Dean for Faculty Affairs and Inclusion.
Professor Casper wants us to think of trauma not just as one person's problem, not just as something exceptional, but as a shared experience that reflects larger historical phenomena like war, racism, and gender violence.
The model that we've been living with is that it's a singular event, usually, that it's something so abrupt and horrible that it takes you out of your everyday lived experience, and then you have to readjust. And that's because your everyday lived experience has been so disrupted. And so the idea behind therapy and recovery is that you want to get back to some semblance of normal, which may or may not be possible.
Right.
Because we don't know what normal is.
Right. And the structures persist.
Absolutely. And
you leave the therapist's office and you're right back in the mix.
You are, exactly. So some of us in sociology and some other social science fields have been thinking about collective trauma, structural trauma, community resilience. How do you build in resilience so that folks don't experience trauma in the first place?
What we are dealing with individually in therapy when we go into that private room is actually collective, and it merits collective reflection and discussion. But we need a better vocabulary for this work.
I'm a little worried that our social media conversations about trauma and triggering diminish it and make it into yet one other thing that becomes part of our interwebs experience. So that's, we're not really thinking of it in a serious, deep way. I also think we have a kind of hollow language for talking about people's lived experiences. So, if we think about a trauma survivor, we have limited language. We say, you were this person, you experienced a trauma, everybody experiences trauma, and then you had to figure out how to recover. There's not a lot of words there, right? So what we lose is the texture of each person's path to survival and thriving. We lose the ways that those stories connected to other stories might help us think about patterns that might work for people to become healed, right? So, I read a lot of memoir about trauma, and I write about trauma, from a creative nonfiction perspective as well as academic. And the texture, the taste, the sensation of what it means and feels like to have survived something gets lost when we shorthand it either into a medical model or a therapeutic model or a hashtag.
According to Professor Casper, we need the chance, the opportunity, not only to think about reacting to or repairing trauma, but using the understanding we gain from traumatic experiences. And what we gain is information that is vitally necessary to broad social change.
In this work that I'm doing on gender-based violence, as much as we want to provide victim advocates and think about healing and recovery, we also want to eradicate gender-based violence.
Right.
How do we do that? What are our imaginaries? How do we interrupt rape culture that leads to these sort of mundane traumas in people's lives?
Now, if you think about all the different dimensions of traumas, and imagine we live in a nation of traumatized communities, refugee and immigrant communities, indigenous communities, veterans, abuse and racial violence survivors. No one speaks of it. What would it look like for those voices, for those histories to be heard and to play a role in our politics? Our politics right now seem so winner. They're all about being a winner. Yeah. They're not about recognizing common woundings, and yet that seems like how we all got here.
I think that's right. What would our politics look like? Well, I feel like our political spaces are very, I think they're very cynical. They're not spaces of hope for many people.
Right. It would be a more sober politics. It would feel a little more grounded. Can you imagine a politics that wasn't about the ambition to win, to beat the other team, but that was about the sobriety and valor of our shared persistence?
And to think about how we might intervene, not only to prevent traumas, but to think about just creating healthier structures. The language of trauma is that we survive. And many of us are very, very good survivors, but surviving is not thriving.
Beyond surviving, beyond taking your meds and going to therapy, there is thriving, and there is doing collective work out loud that makes sense of our experiences and moves whole communities to a better place.
My name is Olivia Chilcote, and I'm a member of the St. Lucie Band of Mission Indians, and I'm an assistant professor at San Diego State University in the American Indian Studies Department. My tribal territory is in the northern San Diego County.
As an Indigenous Californian, Professor Chilcote studies California's historic treatment of its Indigenous communities, which is a deeply violent and traumatic history. Most people don't know that from 1850 through the 1890s, California was the scene of a state and federally funded extermination of Indigenous peoples. The state and federal governments paid bounties for Indian lives. To this day, it's not easy for California Indigenous peoples to talk about it. You can hear it in Professor Chilcote's voice. Sometimes she punctuates difficult recollections with a laugh. Sometimes it's a struggle even to find the words, even with a PhD from UC Berkeley in her pocket.
So there were campaigns by vigilante groups to. It's even hard to talk about it because it's such a violent history to talk about. People planning to murder and massacre.
And there were legal dimensions to the genocide too. The state of California developed apprenticeship programs that amounted to the legal enslavement of Indian children and fractured California's indigenous communities by removing children from their homes and their relatives.
different laws and policies that were passed early on, such as the 1851 Act for the Government and Protection of Indians, a very ironically named law, which was passed in an effort to try to control the California Indian population and actually set up a form of legalized slavery within the state. And so it served to really fracture California Indian communities, and it took children away from their communities because they were put in these apprenticeship programs. Tribal communities were torn apart because of that.
Wow. Yep.
And so, with trying to seek federal recognition through the government today requires tribes to show that they have maintained political and community continuity for, over time. When there's these different laws and policies that fracture tribal communities, it's hard to be able to prove that type of continuity.
Earning recognition is critical because it conveys the authority to a community to be self-governing and to undertake economic development. And things have been so fractured for so long that it's even difficult for historians and scholars like Professor Chilcote to piece the histories back together in a way that conveys continuity.
Trying to actually find documentation or just sources, things like that, because things have been so scattered. There's not just one archive that's right. Where everything is.
Unlike in many other areas of the country, the state of California did not cooperate in the creation of tribal homelands or reservations.
The California state legislature was very against having those treaties passed because the treaties would have provided reservations, areas of land for California Indian peoples to live on. But the state of California, thought that, we don't want the California Indians to have this land. It might be rich in resources.
Professor Chilcote has chosen to spend her academic career putting back together the fragmented history of her people, searching it out in archives across the state. She is literally repairing trauma. And it's draining work.
For me, I, always come back to the support of my tribe and of my family. What we're doing today as a tribal community, I see it connected to every other initiative that our tribe has done since settlers came in and took our land, back in the late 1800s. And so there's always been this concerted effort on the part of my tribal community to engage, whether it be going to the land office in LA or in Washington, D.C., or writing letters to the Indian agents to try and find a solution. Our tribe's effort with this, trying to gain federal recognition, I just see it as part of this continuum. And, there's been that oral knowledge passed down about we just need to do what we can to provide for our community. And so I, myself just reflect on all of, these people from my tribe or my direct ancestors who came before me. And that really does, help me through, because it can be a really, challenging process, and it can really get you down a lot of the time.
What holds her in place is seeing herself as part of an intergenerational community that has been at work to name and honor and piece itself back together. This is a community doing its work together, out loud. No one is alone with the trauma of shared history. Even moments of loss are an opportunity to affirm the survival and continuity of the tribe.
It's just, honestly, just on Friday, I found out that the eldest elder in our community passed away. And I was really upset. And I still, of course I still am, but it also, reminded me that this is something, what our tribe does, and, our family is so important. And, we just have to keep doing what we can, because, I don't want another generation to have to be going through these, the same ongoing struggles that have been going on for so long. So
Professor Chilcote's community is good at holding its own history, but the history of California indigenous communities is not broadly recognized and known beyond tribal peoples. What would happen if these traumatic histories were a part of our shared political awareness?
I think that, if there was a broader acknowledgement about what happened in California, I think that it would be really helpful for educating people about why tribes really value their own tribal sovereignty and self-determination. So their right to their own self-government and their right to decide, what they want for their own communities.
To close, I asked Professor Chilcote if recent turns in United States political culture were as difficult on her genocide surviving people as they were on Suzanne and her fellow Jewish genocide survivors.
There's this understanding that as a tribe, we have a longstanding history that is well before the U.S. And we've dealt with, so many horrible things in our history. And this is just another kind of brick in the road. And, we will be able to just continue what we're doing and, be who we are without caring about the policies of this particular president, because we've dealt with how many presidents so far.
Professor Chilcote and her people will always be the people of this place. They were the people of this place before there was a United States, and they will be whether or not the United States continues. She draws great dignity and strength from knowing who she is and where she stands. Despite genocide, family separation, and political marginalization, no one can take that from her or her people. Just a few miles up the road from Professor Chilcote's tribal homelands, there's another community of American genocide survivors, the Cambodian American community of Long Beach, California. And to understand their experience, I spoke with an expert in Cambodian American history and culture.
So my name is Kathy Schlund-Files, and I'm a professor of English and Asian American Studies at the University of Connecticut.
Professor Schlund-Files and her twin brother were adopted by a couple, an American Air Force pilot and a Japanese woman who grew up near the bombing site at Nagasaki and could not have children. Professor Schlund-Files grew up assuming she was Thai, until she was 23 years old, and made an offhanded joke about the film The King and I.
And my dad said, no, actually, your film is The Killing Fields. And that was actually the revelation that I was, in fact, Cambodian American or ethnically Cambodian as opposed to Thai American. So, and that prompted a bit of an identity crisis because I had no idea what Cambodia's history was. I had no idea about my culture, and that actually prompted a journey that I'm still on by way of recovering that history.
She's been working ever since to put back the deeply fractured and fragmented history of Cambodian American communities. From the late 1970s through the 1990s, more than 150,000 Cambodian refugees entered the United States, fleeing atrocity.
Between 1975 and 1979, over the course of a 3-year, 8-month, 20-day period, the Khmer Rouge oversaw the deaths of approximately 1.7 million Cambodians, and that constitutes 21 to 25% of the population. The Khmer Rouge were a communist regime, an authoritarian regime, intent on engendering a return to year zero, a point before any colonization, imperialism.
Cambodian American communities today have all the familiar symptoms and effects of post-traumatic stress.
You have higher rates of diabetes. You have high rates of blood pressure, higher rates of hypertension, rather. Post-traumatic stress is definitely an issue. There are accounts of people who have suffered from blindness, psychological blindness based on memories of what they experienced.
But the Khmer Rouge genocide was unique in that, seeking to return to a year zero, the regime purposely targeted people who carried memory: artists, traditional musicians, teachers, historians. Many elders did not survive forced labor and starvation. The population now is very young, 84% born after 1980, and many have no direct memory. So reconstructing the history of the genocide, reconstructing memory, has been essential to Professor Shunweil's work and that of the younger Cambodian American artists she interviews.
The question I asked was, well, why do you seem very obsessed with retelling and re-narrating the history that I have just narrated? And what I found was that Cambodian American 1.5 generation folks, that is to reiterate those who were children during the Khmer Rouge period, they wanted to actually find alternative spaces for justice, because the time that I began this work, there had been no tribunal. There had been no real national reparation effort.
Reconstructing memory is a form of seeking justice. Piecing memories back together has helped younger Cambodian Americans grow closer to their parents' generation, the survivors, who customarily do not talk about what they've been through.
Talking during the regime was considered highly dangerous, right? So I'm just going to paraphrase something that was a parable, or not a parable, but kind of proverb. And the idea was that you would survive by acting like a tree. You wouldn't say anything. So that actually exacerbates, some of the issues facing these communities.
You can see the renewed sense of connectedness and resilience in places like Cambodia Town in Long Beach, which is home to the largest population of Cambodians outside of Asia. Every year, Cambodia Town holds a film festival to honor the memory, to educate, to bring it back.
But the point of the Cambodia Town Film Festival is to highlight films that deal specifically with the Cambodian experience, but actually bring it beyond just the killing fields period. So, one of the things that I've noticed, and I think that this is something that resonates for those who do work on the Holocaust, is that, these disastrous moments in history make it so that your existence is defined exclusively according to death and genocide. And I think what the Cambodia Town Film Festival does is really highlight that there was, kind of a resilient sensibility before. There was certainly a sense of resilience during the regime to survive, and then post-regime.
You can also see the connectedness and resilience in the work of people like rapper Prak Lee.
In 2000, he recorded an album in his garage with a karaoke machine. And it was called Dalama, the Endin' is the Beginning. And Dalama was his combination of trauma, drama, and the Dalai Lama. And what that album was envisioned as a hip-hop memoir. So what Pratch did was he actually wrote lyrics based on his parents' experiences surviving the killing fields era, and then also experiences of elders in his community. He put it to a backbeat that was largely kind of a tradition, like a hip hop American backbeat, and then included Khmer court musicians to provide an additional sample. And that's huge, given that 90% of court musicians perished. So he's actually kind of bringing in multiple generations.
Prak Lee debuted his hip hop project at the Cambodian New Year celebration in Long Beach in 2000. And to tell the truth, it wasn't a big hit.
6 months pass, and he gets a phone call from, I believe, a Newsweek reporter who asks him how does it feel to have the #1 record in Cambodia, and he's still working in a karaoke store. So he had no idea that somebody at the festival, at the New Year's festival, took a bootleg copy of his album to Cambodia, played it on Phnom Penh radio, and because it was in Khmer in English, it was immensely popular, but ironically, it was renamed Khmer Rouge Rap. So the reporter actually followed up on this story and wanted to know who this person was. And Prak Lee is credited with not only introducing hip-hop to Cambodia, but also narrating a story of the killing fields that was largely unknown.
Now, mind you, at the time Prashlee's album drops, there have been very few tribunals in Cambodia. Genocide is not spoken of in national politics. There's virtually nothing in the school curriculum. But there is Cambodian American hip-hop recorded on a karaoke machine in a garage in California.
And what's really stunning is how Prashlee memorializes the Killing Fields era, while actually, kind of rapping in a way that highlights the resilience of the Cambodian American community. And he does so seamlessly by engaging the culture of both the United States and Cambodia.
What Professor Shun Viles finds is that these artists are exploring a whole new model of working through trauma. How do you begin to conceive of justice after genocide? There's a notion we hold that you can rationalize trauma and justice, that one person can go to therapy and heal, that one person who committed a wrong against another can be singled out, punished.
It's absurd to think that people, like 1.7 million Cambodians who perished and their families, will receive justice when 5 Khmer Rouge officials are tried. Because that doesn't take into account the fact that everybody was forced to behave in certain ways under the regime, right? So the cadre who may have denied you medicine, or the person who tattled on you and, your family got punished, those are kind of moments that you'll never get reparation for. So going back to the issue of kind of fragmentation, I think that what's interesting is that the point is not to create a whole narrative, but to actually raise, kind of keep in the conversation what happened during the Killing Fields era and why it remains relevant today.
What we can learn from Cambodian American experience and Professor Shun Viles is a wholly different view of justice that could inform a more dignified and responsible national politics. Justice is not just about identifying an individual culprit to put in a cage and call it better.
I think that any story of violation is always a complex story. It's always an unresolved story. So it's not just about those perpetrators who are, government officials. It's about bystanders who allowed this to happen. It's about people who were faced with a very different set of choices, right? So, you kind of see this in Cambodian American literature. There's a profound guilt in surviving. So you actually have children stating that they ate an extra, little bit of rice, and that, it was disastrous for the rest of the family. So I think that, to kind of bring it to a close in terms of that question, I think that justice is not what we should be seeking, but rather kind of more fuller stories about what happened.
Justice is about honoring the depth and extent of our experience by telling the most complete possible version of our histories, including our own stories of guilt and culpability, honoring them, seeing bigger patterns, larger social structures. It's also about weaving these stories into our daily lives in a way that highlights our capacity for joy, humor, and resilience.
And I was talking recently to a Cambodian American poet, Monica Sok, and it's kind of like there was a joyfulness when her father would say, well, when he's watching Survivor, the show Survivor, a Cambodian would obviously win because of the experiences, but we don't ever think of that. I mean, but do we dismiss that joke, or do we kind of take it as part of a larger whole? There's kind of a strength in that. And there is an acknowledgement that, what happened was absolutely awful. But the fact that people are there telling their story highlights not only resilience, but just kind of an amazing amount of power. I used to think that healing was the goal. But I actually think that a more generative thing to consider is, how does the discussion of this experience then make more relevant the Cambodian American experience? That's actually what you get from a lot of 1.5 generation Cambodian American artists, is that they're trying to find out what their parents are not telling them as a way to, again, bring people closer together.
What if we talked about trauma in ways that don't pathologize and isolate victims, but that connect us through the medium of our shared histories and pass wisdom forward through the generations. Imagine if the ceremonies through which immigrants and refugees became citizens included an opportunity for each new citizen to tell and for us to hear what they've been through, not just because there is a kind of healing in telling, but because they carry deeply necessary information to guide the future of a democratic republic. Imagine a Congress populated with Cambodian American fathers who can joke about the TV show Survivor, and truth-telling American Jewish grandmothers who've been both Holocaust refugees and American cheerleaders, and mix in indigenous scholars of history. Start each congressional session with a shared meal and an opportunity for everyone to tell the story of their community. Then sit down and make a strategic plan together for the next 5 years of the experiment we call American democracy. Would you sleep a bit better at night if our politics worked this way? I'm betting you would, and that you'd wake up in the morning ready to do the work of democracy, the work of building relationships, taking care of our communities and our common resources and ideals, the work of change and struggle. This podcast is about creating a space where we can face our anxieties together and go deeper into a place where we can breathe, learn more about our history, listen to the richness of diverse American experiences so that we have a better sense of where we need to go next. I'm not going to give you a list of 10 congressional reps to text. I'm not going to put another item on your political to-do list. I'm going to suggest that this moment is an opportunity to look again at America, at the American democratic experiment, including its failures and ongoing catastrophes. I'm going to tell you that freedom, like beauty, is not and has never been effortless. It comes out of work and struggle. And if you believe that too, well, here's the good news. The next few years are going to make us all a lot more beautiful. Please join us again for Episode 1, Part 3, where I'll bring Suzanne and the experts together. And subscribe to American Beauty so you don't miss Episode 2, when we'll talk about how it feels to move through anxiety into action. Professor Monica Casper's most recent book is entitled Critical Trauma Studies: Understanding Violence, Conflict, and Memory in Everyday Life. This is American Beauty. I'm Joanna Brooks. Please stick with us, subscribe, share, rate, and review today at iTunes. Follow us on Twitter and Insta at _Joanna Brooks. Check in at AmericanBeautyPodcast.com. Thanks to Rachel Taylor for sound production, Case Studio for brand design, and to all the women who gave us words from their hearts for this podcast.